The Murder Witnessed by a Dead Woman. Sherlock Holmes Mystery. Chapter 1. The Letter from a Ghost. It was on a particularly vile Thursday morning in early November, when London had drawn her grey curtains across the sky and the Thames exhaled a cold, sulphurous mist that crept under every door and into every collar, that the first letter arrived at 221B Baker Street, and with it one of the most extraordinary cases that ever demanded the attentions of Mr. Sherlock Holmes. I had arrived at Baker Street that morning with no particular intention beyond returning a monograph. Holmes had lent me on the chemical properties of various tobacco ashes. I found him, as was too frequently his custom, draped across the settee in his mouse-coloured dressing gown, a cold pipe clenched between his teeth, and 3 days' worth of unanswered correspondence stacked beneath a human femur he employed as a paperweight. Fire had burned low. The room smelled of coal smoke, chemical reagents, the faint sweetness of a violin that had been played at some recent and unsociable hour of the night. "Watson," said Holmes, without turning his head, "you have mud on your left boot, but not your right, which means you stepped off the curb to avoid Mrs. Bancroft's terrier, the one that bit you last March, and lost your footing in the gutter outside Regent Street. The monograph is on the table beside you. I no longer need it. I have already memorized the relevant passages. I set the book down with more force than was perhaps strictly necessary. Good morning to you too, Holmes." He uncurled from the settee with the fluid ease of a cat and moved to the window, where the fog pressed its white face against the glass. "Forgive me, Watson. I have been 4 days without a case of sufficient complexity, and I fear my manners decay in proportion to my idleness." He turned, and I saw that his grey eyes were sharp and bright, not the dull, unsettling flatness they acquired when boredom threatened to consume him entirely. Something had already caught his interest, I realised. He was merely waiting for me to notice. Mrs. Hudson knocked and entered, bearing a silver tray with 2 letters. Holmes seized the one with no return address before she had fully set the tray upon the table. He held it to the light from the window, turning it slowly, then brought it to his nose, inhaled once, and set it down. "This one first," he said, pointing instead to a thick envelope bearing the embossed crest of a legal firm. "Hartwell, Beaumont and Cross of Lincoln's Inn Fields." I opened it at his gesture and read aloud. The letter was from a Mr. Reginald Beaumont, a solicitor, writing on behalf of the estate of one Mrs. Dorothea Calloway of Calloway House, Kensington. Mrs. Calloway, the letter explained with considerable delicacy of phrasing, passed away some 11 days prior. She had died of heart failure in her private sitting-room on the 21st of October, approximately 10:15 in the evening. This had been confirmed by her physician and by the coroner. Her death had been entirely unremarkable and had produced a death certificate without controversy. What was remarkable, what was, in fact, so extraordinary that Mr. Beaumont found himself compelled to seek the counsel of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, was that Mrs. Dorothea Calloway appeared to have written and posted a letter dated the 24th of October. 3 days after her death. I looked up from the letter. Holmes was watching me with an expression of intense satisfaction. "And the second letter?" he said quietly. I set down Mr. Beaumont's correspondence and opened the plain envelope. Inside was a single sheet of writing paper, good quality, cream-coloured, faintly watermarked, covered in a small, precise feminine hand. It read as follows: Mr. Holmes, I write to you in great urgency, and in the knowledge that I have very little time. I have witnessed a murder. The victim is not yet dead, but he will be, and when he is, they will say it was natural or accidental, and no one will look more closely. The murderer is known to me. The method is clever, and the proof has been buried where the guilty believe it cannot be found. I cannot name names in writing, This letter may be intercepted. But I will tell you this. The grey painting in the East Study holds what you need. Find it before they do. I am, as you may have been told, already dead. But I am not yet silent. DC. There was a long silence in the room, broken only by the tick of the mantelpiece clock, and a distant rumble of cartwheels on Baker Street below. "Holmes," I said at last, "this is either the most extraordinary posthumous coincidence in the history of the British Post, or, Holmes said crisply, reaching for his coat. Mrs. Dorothea Calloway was murdered, and knew she would be, and took remarkable precautions to ensure someone capable of solving it would eventually receive her message." He snatched the letter from my hand and examined the postmark with his glass. Posted from a Kensington post box on the 24th. The official date of her death was the 21st. He looked at me over the rims of his glass, and his expression was one of pure, electric focus. "There are 3 possibilities, Watson. Either the death certificate is wrong, and she was alive until the 24th. Someone posted this letter on her behalf after her death, or the date of death was deliberately falsified." He paused. "In any of the 3 cases, something criminal has occurred. Fetch your coat. We are going to Kensington." As we descended the stairs, paused and took from his coat pocket the thin volume he kept for the recording of tobacco varieties. He held it for a moment, weighing it in his hand, then placed it carefully back. "A dead woman's letter," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "I confess, Watson, that in 17 years of professional practice, I have never before been briefed by a corpse." Outside the fog-swallowed Baker Street hole, I hailed a cab, gave the address to the driver, and climbed in beside Holmes, who sat perfectly motionless, staring at nothing, cream-coloured letter folded in his hand. I knew better than to disturb him. The great engine of his mind had engaged, and it would not stop until it had arrived somewhere true. Chapter 2. A. Room full of impossible things. Calloway House was a severe, handsome building on a quiet Kensington street. The sort of house that had been built with money and maintained with pride, which wore its respectability like a well-pressed coat. 4 stories of pale stone, iron railings, sash windows with white curtains. It could have belonged to a judge, or a retired general, or a successful physician. It had, in fact, belonged to the late Alderman Geoffrey Calloway, until his death some 12 years earlier, and since then to his widow, the lately deceased Dorothea. Mr. Reginald Beaumont met us at the door, a trim, anxious man of 50, with thin hair carefully oiled, and a nervous habit of adjusting his cufflinks. He had, he explained, received Holmes's telegram within the hour, and had arranged for us to have full access to the house. The household staff remained. A cook, a parlour-maid, a housekeeper named Mrs. Peel, and a manservant called Aldrich, who had served the family for 20 years. 3 other individuals had keys to the house, and had been regular presences during Mrs. Calloway's final weeks. These were her nephew, Mr. Conrad Calloway, who stood to inherit the bulk of the estate, her companion and secretary, a Miss Iris Vance, and her personal physician, Dr. Seward Grantley. All 3 were present on the evening of the 21st, Holmes asked, as we climbed the front steps. "Conrad and Miss Vance were in the house," said Beaumont, lowering his voice as we entered the hallway. Dr. Grantley was called after Mrs. Calloway's collapse, and arrived within 20 minutes. He confirmed death at approximately 11:15. Grey painting in the East Study. You know it. Beaumont blinked. Yes, there is a painting in the East Study. A landscape, I believe, rather large. Mrs. Calloway kept that room largely to herself. Has anyone else been in that room since her death? Conrad, Mr. Calloway, conducted what he described as an inventory of some personal items. Beaumont said, with careful neutrality. He spent several hours in there 2 days after the death. Holmes said nothing, but, I noticed that his jaw had set in a particular way that I had learned to associate with controlled urgency. The east study was on the first floor at the rear of the house, overlooking a small walled garden. It was a remarkable room. The room, I felt immediately upon entering, of a woman of considerable intelligence who had refused to be shaped entirely by the social expectations of her sex. Books covered 3 walls floor to ceiling, organised by subject rather than size or colour, which alone set them apart from the decorative libraries of most drawing rooms. A large mahogany writing desk dominated the centre, surface clear, but for an inkstand, a letter opener of Indian silver, framed photograph of a younger Dorothea Calloway standing beside a man I did not recognise. There was a pianoforte against one wall, its lid closed. Against the east wall, facing the window so that natural light would fall upon it, hung the painting. It was indeed grey, whelmingly, stubbornly, peculiarly grey. A coastal scene of some kind, cliffs and sea, and a sky heavy with coming rain, rendered in a palette so muted that it bordered on monochrome. It was not an untalented work, but it was a strange choice for a sitting room. The frame was ornate gilt, entirely at odds with the painting's austerity, as if someone had dressed a monk in a bishop's robes. Holmes went to it immediately. He did not look at the painting. He looked at the frame. He looked at the wall, behind it, running his fingers along the upper edge. He pressed the lower corner of the frame gently and listened. Then he stepped back and looked at the room. "The desk has been searched," he said, carefully, by someone who knows how to search carefully. But the inkstand has been moved 3 inches to the left. The sealing wax has been set back upside down. Someone was looking through the drawers. He crossed to the pianoforte and lifted the lid. Nothing here. But the middle C key sticks. Someone has recently placed pressure on it beyond what playing would require. If they were pressing down hard, looking for a mechanism. He turned. "Watson, look at the carpet in front of the painting." I looked. The carpet, a Turkish pattern in deep blue, showed a faint compression as if something had recently stood there. Not the painting itself, which was still mounted on the wall, but something placed in front of it. A chair, perhaps, or a step-ladder. "Someone has already searched this room," I said. "Thoroughly," Holmes agreed, "but not intelligently." He smiled, and there was something almost fierce in it. They looked behind the painting. They did not look at it. He produced his magnifying glass and went over the grey canvas centimetre by centimetre. I watched, baffled, for several minutes. Beaumont hovered in the doorway, twisting his cufflinks into orbit. And then Holmes made a low sound, not quite a word, and leaned very close to the lower left corner of the canvas. "There," he said softly. "Come and see, Watson." I leaned in. In the lower left corner of the painting, worked into what appeared to be shadow at the base of a cliff, 4 lines of extremely fine text. Written not in paint, but in a darker medium, ink, plied with a fine nib. So small and so carefully integrated into the tonal values of the painting that they would be entirely invisible to anyone glancing at the work, and very nearly invisible to anyone looking for them. "She wrote in the painting," I said, astonished. "She hid in the painting," Holmes corrected. "She knew some would search the room. She knew they would look behind the frame. She anticipated everything they would do, and left her evidence in the one place a person looking for hidden documents would never think to examine." He read the inscription aloud quietly, so that Beaumont could not hear from the doorway. It said, "The dose is in the decanter. Grantley brought it. Conrad knew. The will was changed. Ask Vance. She saw." Chapter 3. The portrait that watched Holmes insisted we speak to no one in the house about what we had found in the painting. Not Beaumont, not Mrs. Peel, not the manservant Aldrich. He was, as he explained to me in a low voice as we descended to the ground floor, playing a careful game, and the first rule of any such game was to reveal nothing until you had gathered everything. Murderer, if murder there has been, believes themselves safe, he said. That belief is our greatest asset. The moment they feel observed, they become dangerous, and evidence has a remarkable tendency to disappear. He asked Beaumont to arrange interviews with each of the 3 primary associates that afternoon. To the solicitor's credit, he managed this with efficiency. By 2 o'clock, we were seated in Calloway House's formal drawing room. Conrad Calloway had arrived from his chambers in the city. Conrad Calloway was 41 years of age, fond, and he wore the appearance of prosperity, with the easy confidence of a Msfond who was handsome for so long that he had forgotten to question it. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair silvering at the temples in a way that suited him, and eyes of a clear, penetrating blue that I would have called intelligent. Had I not noticed within the first 3 minutes of conversation that they never quite looked directly at Holmes? They moved near him, settled on points slightly to his left or right. Orbited without ever landing was a small thing. Holmes, I suspected, noticed it before I did. Your aunt's death must have been a considerable shock, Holmes said, in the gentle, unhurried tone he employed when he wished to appear utterly unthreatening. Naturally, said Conrad. He sat with his legs crossed, one hand resting on his knee, the very image of composed grief. She had been unwell for some months, as her heart. Dr. Grantley had warned us it was a matter of time. Still, one is never entirely prepared. You were in the house on the evening of the 21st? Was. We dined together, Aunt Dorothea, Miss Vance, and myself. After dinner, Aunt retired to the east study, as was her custom. I remained in the drawing-room, reading. At approximately 10:15, Miss Vance came to inform me that she had found Aunt Dorothea collapsed in her chair. His voice was even, the recollection apparently costing him nothing. I sent Aldrich for Dr. Grantley immediately, and after the death, you spent some time in the east study. The briefest pause. I was conducting an inventory of her private papers, primary heir, that falls to me. Of course, Holmes said pleasantly. Tell me, Mr. Calloway, your aunt kept a decanter in that room? The hand on the knee pressed slightly harder. She kept whiskey. She was old-fashioned about it, kept a decanter on the small table beside her, reading chair. She had a glass each evening. Is the decanter still in the study? Conrad's eyes, for the first time, met Holmes's directly. They held there for 1 second, 2, 3, and then slid away. I imagine so, he said. I didn't notice it particularly. Holmes smiled. Thank you, Mr. Calloway. I think that is all for now. After Conrad had gone, I turned to Holmes immediately, but he held up one finger, a gesture that meant, not yet. He was looking at the doorway through which Conrad had left, and his grey eyes were very still. He is lying, I said in a low voice. About the decanter, Holmes agreed. He has either removed it, or had it removed. The question is whether he did so before or after the inscription was discovered, and whether he found the inscription at all. He rose. Come, I wish to see the study again, and then I wish to speak to Miss Vance. The east study was undisturbed from our earlier visit. Holmes went directly to the small table beside the reading chair, a low round table of walnut, bearing a single ring stain where a decanter had habituated its place. The decanter was gone. In its place was nothing except the ghost of its presence. The ring, pale against the polished wood, faint smell of whiskey that lingered in the fibres of the armchair beside it. Removed within the last 48 hours, Holmes said, crouching to examine the table. The ring is still fresh at the edges. The wood has not had time to dry and darken. He straightened. Someone in this house, or someone with access to this house, has taken the decanter. He paused, looking at the empty table with an expression of profound interest. Which means, Watson, that whatever was in it, whatever substance Dorothea Calloway believed had been placed there. Someone knows it can be found. Someone is very afraid of what a proper analysis would reveal. Above the reading chair, on the wall, hung a large framed portrait of Alderman Geoffrey Calloway, a stern, broad-faced man of perhaps 60, rendered in oils with the unsparing honesty of a good Victorian portrait painter. He had been dead for 12 years, but in that portrait, with its clear, direct, dark-eyed gaze, fixed on the precise spot where his wife's favourite chair had stood, he seemed to watch the room with an expression I could only describe as accusatory. "Holmes," I said. "The painting watched this room, but the portrait watched the chair." He looked at me sharply. "Elaborate." "She put her clues in the coastal painting because no one would look there. But this portrait, Geoffrey Calloway, he's looking directly at where the decanter stood." I hesitated. "I don't mean the portrait literally saw anything. But she arranged her room so that the portrait faced her chair. I wonder whether she found comfort in that, or whether she was sending a message." Holmes was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Watson, you are occasionally more perceptive than you allow yourself credit for. The portrait faces the chair faces the window faces the garden." He moved to the window and looked out. "And in the garden there is a glass house. Chapter 4-3 men, and a missing hour. Iris Vance was 28 years old, and she had the particular self-contained quality of a woman who has learned from experience that the world will not arrange itself for her comfort, and who has accordingly arranged herself for the world. She was slight, dark-haired, fine-boned features and eyes of a grey-green that were simultaneously watchful and fatigued. She wore black, half-mourning, more than the professional obligation of a secretary would strictly demand, and she sat in her chair with her hands folded in her lap as though she had waiting for this interview since the morning of the 22nd of October. Holmes took a chair across from her and regarded her with an expression of courteous attention. "You found Mrs. Calloway," he said. Not a question, not quite a statement, but something in between. "Yes," said Miss Vance. "I went to the study at 10:15 to see whether she wanted her evening cocoa. She made a habit of it. She was in her chair, and she was already gone." Something moved across her face. Grief. Or perhaps something more complicated than simple grief. I called for Mr. Conrad immediately. "How did she appear? Was there anything unusual about the room?" Miss Vance's hands tightened slightly in her lap. "She appeared peaceful, as if she had simply fallen asleep. Her book was open on her knee. Pause. The decanter was on the table. She had had a glass of whiskey, as she always did. Had she poured it herself, or had someone brought it to her?" Something shifted in Miss Vance's expression, the smallest tightening around the eyes, as if a door had been opened that she had been keeping carefully shut. "I brought it," she said. "I always brought her evening whiskey at 9 o'clock. She poured her own glass from the decanter. I brought the decanter up, set it on the table, and left her. Was Dr. Grantley in the house on the evening of the 21st before Mrs. Calloway's collapse?" Miss Vance met Holmes's gaze steadily. He called in the afternoon. "Around 4 o'clock. A routine visit," he said. "He didn't stay long, perhaps 30 minutes. She hesitated. And in that hesitation, I saw Holmes's attention sharpen to a point. He went to the study to speak to Mrs. Calloway privately. I made tea and brought it to them, and then left them. And the decanter, where was it at 4 o'clock? In its usual place, on the table beside the reading chair, where it always was. And after Dr. Grantley's visit, before you brought the decanter up that evening?" Miss Vance said. "On the sideboard in the dining room. Decanted it fresh each week from the bottle in the wine cellar." Holmes nodded slowly. "Miss Vance," he said, with a gentleness that I had seen him use only when he needed something that could not be extracted by any other means. "I must ask you something, and I need you to answer it as precisely as you can." Was the decanter in the dining room between Dr. Grantley's afternoon visit and the time you brought it upstairs at 9 o'clock? A silence. The clock on the mantelpiece counted 4 seconds. 5. "No," said Miss Vance at last. Her voice was very quiet. "It was not. Where was it?" "I don't know," she said. "I went to collect it from the sideboard at 8:45, and it was gone. I found it in the kitchen, on the counter, near the scullery door. I assumed Mrs. Peel had moved it. I did not ask." Holmes sat very still. "You brought it upstairs without questioning why it had been moved?" She stopped. Her hands unfolded in her lap and then refolded, a gesture of profound self-recrimination. "I had no reason to think anything of it. Decanters are moved. It was where I found it. I simply—" She stopped again. When she next spoke, voice had changed. It was lower, rougher. "She had told me something 2 days before, Mrs. Calloway. She said she was going to write a letter. She said she was frightened. I asked her of what. She wouldn't say. She asked me whether I trusted Dr. Grantley." Miss Vance looked at Holmes with an expression that contained equal parts grief and controlled fury. "I told her I did. I thought she was being fanciful. Her health had made her anxious. I told her I did. And Conrad Calloway, on the evening of the 21st, when was he in the dining room?" "He was in and out," she said, "after dinner. He said he wanted a brandy. He was in the dining room around 8, I think, perhaps a little after." Holmes rose. "Thank you, Miss Vance. You have been more helpful than you know." He paused at the doorway. "The letter she asked you about. Writing a letter. Did she tell you to whom she was writing?" Miss Vance looked up at him. For the first time, something very like hope entered her expression. "She said she was writing to someone very clever, someone who wouldn't be deceived by convenient explanations." Chapter 5. The Perfumer's Secret Doctor. Seward Grantley arrived at Calloway House at 4 o'clock precisely, which told Holmes rather more than punctuality typically reveals. Man who arrives at the exact agreed time rather than a minute early or a minute late is a man who has been waiting, not for the appointment itself, but for the careful moment of it. He had calculated, Holmes later told me, proud, exactly how long he should appear to take. Getting ready and arrived having timed himself to the minute was the behaviour of a man who had rehearsed. Grantley was 55, compact and neat, with a physician's careful, possessing eyes, and the kind of trim grey beard that speaks of professional vanity, carefully controlled. He was, I noted with the professional interest of one doctor observing another, in excellent physical condition. No tremor in the hands, clear eyes, colour. He appeared entirely at ease, which was itself a kind of information. "A dreadful business," he said, settling into the chair with a sympathetic shake of the head. "Poor Dorothea. I had been managing her cardiac condition for 3 years. It was a matter of time, but one always hopes." He folded his hands. "How may I assist you, Mr. Holmes? I have already given a full statement to the coroner." "I'm sure you have," Holmes said pleasantly. "I merely have a few small points of curiosity. Your visit on the afternoon of the 21st. Routine, as you described to Miss Vance?" "Entirely. You went to the East Study to speak with Mrs. Calloway privately. What did you discuss?" "Her medication regime. I had been considering adjusting her digitalis prescription. I wished to discuss it with her without alarming Miss Vance or Mr. Calloway unnecessarily." "Digitalis," Holmes repeated, nothing in his tone. No inflection, no emphasis. Just the word, placed in the room like a marker. "For her heart," Grantley said smoothly. "Quite standard, of course. And while you were in the study, did you touch the decanter on the table? The whiskey?" "I may have." Grantley's voice didn't change. "I think I moved it to put down my bag. I don't recall precisely." "You don't recall precisely," Holmes echoed. But you do recall the decanter was there? I suppose I must, since you've asked about it. Grantley smiled. The smile of a man who has found a position and intends to hold it. But I am afraid I really cannot be more specific about the movements of a whiskey decanter 6 weeks ago. Holmes appeared to accept this. He changed direction with apparent casualness. You are a man of some chemical knowledge beyond the ordinary physician's training, are you not, Dr. Grantley? I understand you lectured at St. Bartholomew's some years ago on pharmacology, specifically on the cardiac glycosides. For the first time, something moved in Grantley's eyes. Not fear, not yet, but the recognition of a skilled player who has just felt the ground shift beneath his feet. That was some time ago, he said. An occasional lecture series, nothing more. Fascinating subject, Holmes said. The cardiac glycosides. So useful in small doses, so lethal in large ones, and so extremely difficult to distinguish in post-mortem examination from the natural effects of advanced cardiac disease. He paused. Particularly in elderly patients with a documented heart condition. The coroner, seeing what he expects to see, might overlook certain indicators entirely. Grantley held very still. I'm not entirely sure what you are suggesting, Mr. Holmes. I am not suggesting anything, Holmes said, rising. I am merely appreciating the pharmacology as any student of the subject would. He extended his hand. Grantley, after a fractional hesitation, shook it. Thank you for coming, Doctor. I expect we shall speak again. When Grantley had gone, I found Holmes at the window of the drawing room, watching the doctor's carriage pull away into the fog, went to stand beside him. He's our man, I said. He is part of it, Holmes corrected, but not all of it. Did you notice his hands when I mentioned the Digitalis lecture? They tightened. Slightly. They did. But did you also notice his lapel? I had not. Holmes told me what he had observed. On the left lapel of Grantley's overcoat, faint it would escape notice, entirely, under anything less than very careful examination, was a trace of powder, pale, almost white, with a very slightly sweet chemical odour that Holmes had detected when Grantley had leaned forward during the handshake. Holmes had placed it immediately. It was a distinctive compound, not a common household substance, only one practical pharmaceutical application, and one source within a 10-mile radius of Kensington. A perfumer's laboratory in Pimlico, Holmes said. Hargrove and Sons. They supply a number of the capital's pharmacists, and they are also Watson. If you consult the trade directories, the sole London supplier of a certain exotic botanical extract, which, in sufficient concentration, produce cardiac arrest in a manner essentially indistinguishable from natural causes. He turned from the window. I need to go to Pimlico, and you need to find out where that decanter has gone. Chapter 6. Witness who cannot speak. The search for the missing decanter took me the better part of the following day, and led me through the undignified, but ultimately productive, territory of Calloway House's kitchen, scullery, wine cellar, dustbins, and, by a route of inquiry that involved 2 housemaids, 1 cook, remarkably candid conversation with Aldrich the manservant, to a locksmith's shop on Brompton Road. Aldrich, I should explain, the sort of servant who had been in one family's employ long enough to develop a loyalty that transcended individual members of that family. He had served Alderman Geoffrey Calloway, and through him had come to serve Dorothea, and he had a quiet, steady decency about him that I trusted instinctively. He was also, as I discovered over a cup of tea in the kitchen, while Mrs. Peel pretended to be doing something at the range, the only member of the household who had noticed what happened to the decanter. Mr. Conrad took it, Aldrich said. His voice was low, almost expressionless, in the manner of a man who has decided to say a difficult thing and intends to say it simply, without drama. The morning after Mrs. Calloway died, he came down before breakfast, went to the dining room, took it out in a canvas bag. I saw him from the hall. He told me he was disposing of the old drink, that there would be no point keeping it now. Aldrich paused. I thought it was strange. The decanter had been on the table in her study when she died. Miss Vance had taken it back down at some point during the night, I think, or early morning. But it was in the dining room when Mr. Conrad took it. I noted that. Did you see where he went with it? I asked. He called a cab. I watched from the front step. He had it with him. It took me 2 hours of methodical inquiry, of visiting the cab ranks, describing Conrad Calloway, tracking a route through 3 separate drivers' recollections, to establish that Conrad had been taken to Brompton Road on the morning of the 22nd, where he had visited a locksmith's shop. The locksmith himself, a Mr. Fenwick, was a small, sharp-eyed man who dealt in safes, keys, and, as was apparent from the more discreet portion of his shop, in the discreet disposal of items that clients preferred not to have traced. He remembered Conrad Calloway. He had, he said carefully, accepted a package for disposal, a glass decanter wrapped in cloth. He had broken it, as was his practice with glass items brought to him for such purposes, and disposed of the pieces. I explained with equal care that the decanter was material evidence in a criminal inquiry, and that while the glass itself was gone, I required a precise description of the contents. Had there been any residue, any smell, any colour to the remaining liquid? Fenwick thought carefully. A very small amount left at the bottom, he said finally. Mostly evaporated by the time I dealt with it, but it smelled. It smelled bitter. Not like ordinary whiskey. Something bitter underneath. I went from Fenwick's shop to Holmes at Baker Street, where he had returned from Pimlico with a look of quiet triumph that he was almost, but not quite, containing. The decanter is gone, I told him. Destroyed. I expected as much, said Holmes. But we have something better than the decanter, Watson. We have the supplier's records. He spread a page of notes across the table. Hargrove and Sons in Pimlico supplied Grantley's private dispensary on 3 separate occasions in the past year with a compound, an exotic botanical glycoside, in quantities far exceeding anything that could be justified by his patient list. The last purchase was on the 19th of October, 2 days before Dorothea Calloway's death. Can we prove it was administered to her without the decanter's contents? Not directly. Which is precisely why the decanter was destroyed. Holmes was quiet for a moment, tapping his fingertips together. Dorothea Calloway, in writing her inscription in the painting, wrote, "Grantley brought it." Conrad knew. She was specific. Grantley supplied the means. Conrad knew the plan, possibly facilitated it. The question is, who in this triangle had the primary motive? The will, I said. She mentioned the will. It was changed. Yes, Beaumont is looking into that. There is, I suspect, prior will and a revised one that together will tell us a great deal. He rose and began to pace. Here is what troubles me, Watson. Dorothea Calloway wrote that letter on the 24th of October, 3 days after her death, or what was certified as her death. Which returns us to the question I raised on the first morning. Was she actually alive on the 24th? And if so, where was she? And how did the coroner certify a death that had not yet occurred? Stared at him. You think the death was staged? I think, said Holmes carefully, that Dorothea Calloway was a woman of exceptional intelligence, who was frightened, but not passive. I think she may have anticipated the attempt on her life, and taken steps, remarkable, desperate steps, to survive it. He paused. Or I am wrong. She died on the 21st, and someone posted that letter on her behalf. In either case, someone is still alive who knows the truth. We need to find them. Her. Chapter 7, The Forger's Apprentice. It was Beaumont who handed us the revised will, with the apologetic air of a man delivering news he knows, will upset everyone and can do nothing about. The document had been executed on the 15th of October, 6 days before Dorothea Calloway's death, and it materially altered the distribution Calloway estate in one significant respect. The prior will, which Beaumont had prepared some 3 years earlier at Mrs. Calloway's own direction, had divided the estate 3 ways. The bulk to Conrad Calloway, a substantial annuity to Miss Iris Vance, and a considerable bequest to a charitable society for the education of women. The revised will eliminated the charitable bequest entirely and removed Miss Vance's annuity. Everything, the house, the investments, the property in Somerset, the entirety of an estate valued at somewhere north of £40,000, went to Conrad Calloway alone. "Beaumont," said Holmes, looking up from the document, "did you prepare this will?" "I did not," said Beaumont with some force. "Was executed at another firm, Marchmont and Webb, near the Strand. I was entirely unaware of it until the probate process required its disclosure. Naturally, it supersedes my document." "Have you examined it carefully?" "I have," said Beaumont. "I can find no legal deficiency in its execution. 2 witnesses properly attested Mrs. Calloway's signature, and it does appear to be her signature." He hesitated. However, Holmes prompted, "when I drafted the original will 3 years ago, Mrs. Calloway told me something about her intentions that she made very clear. She said that under no circumstances would she ever leave Miss Vance unprovided for. She used those words exactly. Under no circumstances. She was, she said, too well acquainted with the precarity of women in service to do otherwise. She was, Mr. Holmes, very firm about it. The will was forged," Holmes said. "Not a question." "I cannot prove that," Beaumont said quickly. "I am merely telling you what I know of her intentions." "You have done exactly the right thing," Holmes said. He held the will up to the light from the window, turning it slowly. "Watson, come and look at the signature." I came to look. Dorothea Calloway's signature was elegant, characterful. The kind of signature that develops over 70 years of consistent practice and becomes as individual as a fingerprint. Holmes pointed to the document, and I looked closely at the signature there. "It's very good," I said. "It is extremely good," Holmes agreed. But the pen lifted once in the middle of the name where the original never lifts. Here, at the junction of the O and the T in Dorothea. A copyist's hesitation, entirely invisible to a layman, unmistakable to anyone who has studied handwriting with even moderate seriousness. He set the document down. "Now, the question is, produced this forgery? Because this is professional work, Watson. This is not Conrad Calloway sitting at his desk with a sheet of practice paper. This required someone with specific expertise." Holmes spent the following morning at what I privately thought of as the least glamorous phase of his investigations, a methodical, systematic inquiry into the professional forgers of London. He had, over the years, accumulated a remarkable knowledge of this community, their styles, their specialisms, their professional signatures, as it were, very act of forging the signatures of others. By the afternoon he had narrowed the field considerably. By evening he had a name, Josias Crumb, formerly of Clerkenwell, currently operating, on a selective and discreet basis, from an address in Southwark. We visited Crumb in the early evening. He was a small, precise man of 60, with ink permanently ground into the lines of his fingers, who lived in rooms so crammed with books, papers, and writing implements that navigation required a degree of skill. He had, Holmes explained to him with considerable directness, forged a document that was likely to be material evidence in a murder inquiry. The police, Holmes pointed out, had not yet been involved. Crumb could choose to cooperate voluntarily, or he could choose to answer questions in a police station, in considerably less comfortable surroundings. Crumb cooperated. He had been commissioned, he said, by letter, paid in advance by bank draft, to produce a copy of a will in the name of Dorothea Calloway, with a signature to match stamps enclosed in the commissioning letter. He had never met the client. The draft had been drawn on an account at a city bank under the name of a trading company. He had delivered the completed document to a postal address in Kensington, which turned out, on subsequent investigation, to be a printer's shop that accepted packages for collection. The letter commissioning the forgery, Holmes said. "Did you keep it?" Crumb hesitated. Then, with the particular expression of a man choosing the lesser of two evils, he went to a locked box beneath a loose floorboard and produced a folded letter. Holmes unfolded it, read it once, and held it out to me. The handwriting was familiar. It was the handwriting of a physician. A small, precise, controlled hand that I had seen before. Signing a statement for the coroner, in records I had persuaded Beaumont to show me that very morning, was Dr. Seward Grantley's handwriting. Chapter 8 Blood on the Ivory Keys. We had by this point sufficient evidence to bring the matter before Inspector Lestrade, and indeed Holmes had sent word to Scotland Yard that morning that a case of probable murder was developing, and that the inspector might make himself available. Lestrade arrived at Baker Street that evening in a state of cautious enthusiasm, which was his customary attitude when Holmes presented him with something he could not immediately dismiss and could not quite accept. "So," said Lestrade, settling into the armchair nearest the fire and accepting the pipe Holmes offered him, "you have a dead woman who may or may not be dead, a forged will, a missing decanter, a physician who buys exotic substances in industrial quantities. What you don't have is a body." "We have a certified body," Holmes said. "What I question is whether the certified cause of death is accurate. The coroner's report says cardiac arrest, natural causes. You want me to go back to the coroner and suggest he examine a 70-year-old woman's corpse for traces of a substance that the decanter, your only physical evidence, has been destroyed." "I want you to apply for an exhumation order," Holmes said. "Yes." Lestrade puffed his pipe. "On the basis of an inscription in a painting and a dead woman's letter that she may or may not have written. On the basis of a forged will executed 6 days before her death, a pharmaceutical purchase made 2 days before her death, a missing decanter with a bitter smell, and a manservant's testimony about its disposal." Holmes counted these on his fingers with a patience that was, I thought, somewhat pointed. "That is, I would suggest, a reasonable basis." Lestrade made a non-committal sound that I had learned over years to interpret as reluctant agreement. "I'll see what I can do," he said, "but it takes time. And if the body shows nothing, Holmes—" "If the body shows nothing, Lestrade, I will retire from this case and trouble you no further." Holmes smiled. "But it will show something. I am entirely certain of it." Lestrade left. Holmes immediately put on his coat. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Back to Calloway House. There is something I wish to check, and I would prefer to do it before Conrad Calloway realizes how close we are." He paused at the door. "The pianoforte in the East Study, Watson. You remember I examined it? The middle C key. Someone pressed it hard, too hard for playing. I dismissed it initially as a search. Someone looking for a hidden compartment in the instrument. But I have been thinking about it since." He opened the front door to the fog-laden night. Dorothea Calloway was not merely a woman of intelligence. She was a woman of method. She did not hide one clue. She hid a system of clues, each one pointing to the next. The painting pointed to the decanter. Portrait pointed to the garden. Now I want to know what the pianoforte points to. We arrived at Calloway House at 9:30. Aldrich let us in without question, with the quiet reliability of a man who had decided whose side he was on. The house was silent. Conrad Calloway had not been in that day, according to Aldrich, but had telephoned to say he would be calling the following morning. Miss Vance was in her rooms upstairs. Mrs. Peel was in the kitchen. Holmes went directly to the east study and to the pianoforte. He lifted the lid and pressed middle C. Gently this time, with one finger listening. Then he pressed it harder. Then he crouched beside the instrument and felt along the underside of the keyboard housing with careful fingers, his face turned away, and his eyes closed in the manner he sometimes employed when his sense of touch needed to work without the interference of vision. "There," he said softly. I crouched beside him. Beneath the keyboard housing, attached to the internal frame with a small hook, was a flat package wrapped in oilskin. Holmes unhooked it and unwrapped it carefully on the floor of the study. Inside was a folded letter, 5 pages of close, precise handwriting, and a small glass vial, tightly stoppered, containing perhaps 2 teaspoons of amber liquid. Holmes held the vial to the lamplight for a long moment without opening it. Then he looked at the letter. I read over his shoulder as he turned the pages, his face going very still in the way that it did when each new line of evidence confirmed what he had already expected. It was a letter from Dorothea Calloway to Sherlock Holmes, dated the 19th of October, 2 days before her scheduled death, 6 pages long. It named names, described methods, gave dates and times and quantities and motives with the systematic precision of a woman who had spent a considerable time thinking very carefully and writing very exactly. And at the bottom of the last page, in the same small, precise hand, were these words: "The vial contains a sample I extracted from the decanter on the evening of the 19th, having observed Grantley's attentions to it during his afternoon visit. I hope it survives. I hope you find it. If you are reading this, I did not survive to see the truth told. I ask only that you tell it." I looked at Holmes. His face in the lamplight was, for one unguarded moment, something other than the cold, brilliant mask he generally presented to the world. There was something in it, a quality I rarely saw there, that resembled admiration. "She saved a sample," I said. She knew. She knew what was in the decanter, and she saved a sample, and she hid it. "She was remarkable," Holmes said quietly. Then the mask came back. It always did. He wrapped the vial and the letter carefully in the oilskin. "Come, we have work to do." Pulled. Chapter 9. Holmes Plays the Fool. The analysis of the vial's contents took Holmes the entirety of the following day. He vanished into his chemical laboratory, a corner of Baker Street that smelled permanently of sulphur and mystery, and I made myself useful by visiting Beaumont at Lincoln's Inn, acquiring copies of the various documents we would need, paying a call on my own physician acquaintances to gather what background I could on the pharmacological properties of the substance Holmes had identified. What I learned from a colleague at St. Bartholomew's who specialised in toxicology confirmed Holmes's hypothesis precisely. Compound in question, an extract derived from a specific species of South American plant, produced a cardiac glycoside effect indistinguishable from digitalis toxicity in its final presentation, but left a distinct chemical signature in body tissue that could be identified by a sufficiently skilled analyst, even several weeks post-mortem, if the examiner knew specifically what to look for. Without knowing what to look for, coroner, conducting a routine examination on an elderly woman with documented cardiac disease, would find nothing remarkable. The sample Holmes had found, we could now tell a pathologist precisely what to seek. Holmes emerged from his laboratory at 7:30 that evening with the contained satisfaction of a chess player who has seen 5 moves ahead and confirmed that the board will resolve as predicted. He poured himself a cup of cold tea, drank it standing up, then sat down across from me with his long fingers interleaved. "The vial contains what I expected," he said. "Compound was present in high concentration. Introduced into the whiskey, which would have masked the bitterness adequately for 1 glass. was already to the slight already accustomed taste that her legitimate digitalis prescription would have given her palate. He set down the cup. The letter confirms the mechanism perfectly. Grantley introduced the compound into the decanter during his afternoon visit on the 19th. He told Mrs. Calloway he was adjusting her medication, meaning she took her evening whiskey without suspicion, as she always did. The dose was calculated to be delayed in effect. Long enough for him to be gone from the house, short enough to produce collapse before 10 o'clock. Conrad Calloway was in the house to ensure the body was found and to call Grantley back as the attending physician, thereby controlling the death certification. The revised will, forged on Grantley's instructions, was ready to be produced at probate. And the motive, I asked. Why was Grantley involved? What did he gain? Conrad Calloway owes Dr. Grantley a very substantial sum of money. Holmes said, £17,000. The debt is some 4 years old, accumulated through a sequence of business ventures that Conrad managed and acknowledged and Grantley financed, all of which failed. Under the original will, Conrad's inheritance was more than adequate to service the debt. But Dorothea Calloway had become suspicious of her nephew's financial management, perhaps of the relationship between him and Grantley, and had been contemplating a further revision to the will that would have placed the estate in trust. Had she done so, Conrad would have inherited an income, not a capital sum, and Grantley would have waited years for repayment, if at all. He paused. A dying woman was an inconvenience. A dead woman was, from their perspective, a solution. I sat with this for a moment. They killed her to protect a debt. They killed her to protect an inheritance and a financial relationship. Yes. Holmes's voice was entirely flat when he said it. The flatness that in him conveyed a very strong feeling by suppressing it entirely. He rose and went to the window. The fog had come back. It was always coming back, that November, and, Baker Street below, was a river of orange gaslight and grey air. Holmes stood with his hands clasped behind his back and stared into it for a long moment. "Tomorrow," he said, "I am going to be a complete fool." Stared at him. "I beg your pardon?" "I am going to visit Conrad Calloway at his chambers in the city and behave as if I have found nothing of significance. I am going to suggest, with appropriate embarrassment, that I have been pursuing a theory that has entirely collapsed. The letter from Mrs. Calloway was either the work of a confused mind in her final days, or possibly a forgery, by a disappointed legatee. I am going to imply that Miss Vance is the more probable suspect for any irregularity. I am going to be humble confused, and thoroughly wrong." He turned from the window, and his grey eyes were very bright. "Conrad Calloway will believe me, because men like Conrad Calloway expect to be cleverer than other people. He will believe me, because he wants to believe me. While he is busy believing me, I will be watching exactly where he goes, and to whom, and what he says." "You want him to contact Grantley," I said slowly. "I want him to feel safe enough to contact Grantley, and when he does, I want Lestrade's men ready." Holmes picked up his violin from the chair where it had been resting. "By the day after tomorrow, Watson, this case will be finished, one way or another." Chapter 10. The Second Death. What Holmes had not anticipated, what none of us had anticipated, was that the situation would accelerate beyond our control. During the night of the 28th of November, when a second crime was committed that very nearly altered everything, I received a telegram at 2 in the morning, an hour when no telegram means good news, informing me that there had been an incident at Miss Iris Vance's lodgings in Bayswater, where she had moved following Mrs. Calloway's death. She was alive, the telegram said, but had been attacked. I dressed in 4 minutes and was in a cab, heading for Bayswater in 6. Holmes met me on the pavement outside the building. He had somehow arrived before me, which no longer surprised me. He was in his coat and scarf, face very alert, his eye scanning the street. "She is well," he said immediately, reading my expression. "Shaken, bruised, but well. Someone entered through the window of her sitting room on the ground floor between midnight and 1. She heard them, called out. And they fled. They took nothing. There was nothing here to take. But they searched the room." "Looking for what?" I asked, following him up the steps. "For what she knew," Holmes said. "Conrad has been thinking. He knows that Mrs. Calloway told Miss Vance something in those final days. Miss Vance herself admitted it in her interview. He does not know precisely what. He is growing nervous. His belief that Holmes is baffled and in retreat may have emboldened him this evening, perhaps the opposite. Perhaps my visit to his chambers this morning paradoxically increased his anxiety. In either case, this," he gestured at the street, the disrupted building, the whole situation, was a miscalculation. It was not the controlled, careful criminality of the original plan. This was panic. Miss Vance was sitting in the kitchen of her lodgings, wrapped in a shawl, before a crowd, a host, with a bruise on her left forearm, where she had been gripped or struck when she encountered the intruder at the doorway to her sitting room. She was pale, but controlled, which I was beginning to understand was simply how she was, controlled as a matter of necessity, with the steadiness of someone who has learned that losing her composure will help nothing and may cost something. She told us what had happened with precision and brevity. She had woken to a sound from the sitting room. She had gone to the doorway and seen a figure by her writing desk. The figure had turned there had been a moment. She described it as very brief, in which she had seen his face by the light of the street lamp outside the window, before he struck her arm aside and ran. "You recognized him," Holmes said. It was not a question. Miss Vance looked at the table surface for a moment, then, "Yes, was it Conrad Calloway?" A long pause. "No," she said. "It was someone I have seen before, but not often. A man who visited Calloway House 3 times in the last year. Dr. Grantley brought him. He was introduced as an assistant, laboratory technician of some kind." She looked up. "I remember thinking he seemed uncomfortable in the house, as if he was not accustomed to being in households of that sort." "Height? Build? Distinguishing features?" Holmes asked, the rapid precision of a man taking dictation from a source he trusts. Miss Vance described the man with a clarity that impressed me. Perhaps 35 years old, medium height, a specific scar through the left eyebrow from an old cut, ink staining on the right hand's index finger, a slight hesitation in the left leg, suggesting an old injury. Holmes listened, nodded twice, and rose from his chair. "Stay in this building," he said to Miss Vance. "Do not go to Calloway House. Do not contact Conrad Calloway or Dr. Grantley for any reason." He paused. "You are not in danger tonight. They have been frightened off. But caution is advisable. A beat. You have done everything correctly, Miss Vance. Everything that was possible." Something in his voice when he said it, a quality of seriousness that was not his usual register, made her look at, sharply. Then she nodded, a small, tight movement of the head, and looked back at the table. Outside, I asked Holmes, "The technician, you know who he is?" "I know who he is," Holmes agreed, flagging a passing hansom. "His name is Pellard. He works, or worked, at Hargrove and Sons. He is, I suspect, the man who prepared the compound and supplied it to Grantley." He climbed in. "He is also now a desperate man who knows he has been seen. And desperate men who know they have been seen are the most dangerous variety of criminal." He looked at me as the cab moved off. "The net is closing, Watson. We must close it tonight." Chapter 11. A. Trap laid in candlelight. What Holmes did in the hours between 3 and 7 o'clock that morning remains, in its specific operational details, somewhat outside my ability to fully reconstruct. I know that he sent 4 telegrams. I know that Lestrade was one recipient, and that the others were addressed to parties I did not immediately identify. I know that Holmes changed his coat somewhere between Bayswater and the city. I saw him in a brown coat at 3:30, and in an entirely different grey coat at 6. And I know that by 6 in the morning, when the gas lamps were still burning against the thin winter dawn, he had arranged for the following sequence of events to occur. Conrad Calloway would receive at 7 o'clock a note in an envelope bearing the crest of Hartwell, Beaumont and Cross, informing him that new evidence had come to light in the matter of his aunt's estate. Evidence that required him to attend an urgent meeting at Calloway House at 9 o'clock that morning. The note was composed by Holmes and dispatched by a street boy under Beaumont's name, Beaumont's somewhat reluctant but ultimately cooperative authorization. Dr. Grantley would receive at 7 o'clock a note in a plain envelope containing only this: "Pellard has been seen. Meet at the house at 9. Destroy this." The note was composed by Holmes and dispatched by a different street boy, without any sender's name. And Pellard himself, the technician, the man Miss Vance had seen in her sitting room. Holmes had located at his lodgings in Lambeth through a process of inquiry that I could only describe as supernatural in its speed, and had arranged for 2 of Lestrade's plainclothes constables to take up positions there. The purpose of the arrangement, as Holmes explained to me while we ate a hurried breakfast at Baker Street, was triangulation. "I need all 3 of them," he said. "Conrad alone gives us the conspiracy, but not the mechanism. Grantley alone gives us the mechanism. But Conrad's lawyers will spend years creating reasonable doubt. Pellard alone gives us the supply chain, but not the intent." He spread marmalade with the focused application of a man conducting a chemical experiment. But all 3 of them, in the same room, responding to unexpected stimuli. That will give us what we need. "What unexpected stimuli?" I asked. "Are you planning to introduce?" Holmes looked at me over his toast. "Me," he said simply. We arrived at Calloway House at 10 minutes to 9. Aldrich let us in with the calm steadiness I had come to rely on. Troud and 2 constables were already positioned in the dining room, which connected via a corridor to the drawing room where the confrontation intended to occur. Holmes checked the layout of the drawing room with a brisk efficiency, noting sight lines, exits, relative positions of chairs, and then sat down in the wing chair nearest the fireplace with the unhurried air of a man waiting for a train he knows will come. Conrad Calloway arrived at 9:05, expecting a solicitors' meeting. He found Holmes. The expression that crossed Conrad's face in the moment before he recovered it was, in its brief revelatory flash, one of the most informative things I had ever observed. It was not merely surprise. It was the expression of a man who has been safe, and suddenly is not. A calculation interrupted, a confidence shaken, perfectly constructed story suddenly under threat of revision. "Mr. Holmes," he said. "I was expecting Beaumont, Mr. Beaumont asked me to represent his interests this morning." Holmes said pleasantly, "Do sit down, Mr. Calloway. Dr. Grantley will be along shortly." Conrad sat. He sat very carefully in the manner of a man choosing every movement. "Grantley," he said. "Why would Grantley be here?" "I took the liberty of inviting him," said Holmes. "There are matters that concern you both." The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. Conrad's blue eyes moved around the room with the controlled casualness of a man who is very worried and does not intend to show it. He said nothing further. Holmes examined his fingernails. I stood by the window and watched the street. Grantley arrived at 9:14. He stepped into the drawing room, saw Conrad, then saw Holmes, and in that sequence of recognitions, I watched the physician's professional composure perform a remarkable and entirely revealing act of self-preservation, pulling itself together over a catastrophic surprise like a stage curtain, lowering over an unfinished performance. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "this is unexpected." "Please sit," said Holmes, gesturing to the chair across from Conrad. "Thank you both for coming. I shall be brief." He folded his hands. "I have in the past week obtained the following. A sample of the substance introduced into Mrs. Calloway's decanter. On the evening of the 19th of October, a corresponding analytical confirmation of its nature and effects. A letter written by Mrs. Calloway on that date, naming both of you in precise terms and describing the method. A forger's testimony and the original commissioning letter, in your handwriting, Dr. Grantley, for the fabricated will. A record of the purchase of a sufficient quantity of the relevant compound from Hargrove and Sons, and a witness who can place Pellard. Your laboratory technician, Dr. Grantley, at the scene of an unlawful entry last night." He paused. "I have, in short, everything." The room was very quiet. "Lestrade," Holmes said, at normal speaking volume. The door from the corridor opened. Chapter 12. The Clockmaker's Confession. What occurred in the first minutes after Lestrade's entry into the drawing-room was, in its way, as illuminating as anything that had preceded it. Conrad Calloway looked at Grantley. Grantley looked at Conrad, and in that mutual glance, brief, searing, naked of pretension, I saw something that I think neither of them had intended to reveal. Each was calculating how much the other would say, and how much they could survive if the other said everything. It was Grantley who broke first. He was, stripped of the physician's authority and social confidence, a more frightened man than Conrad. Perhaps because he had more to lose, professionally, or perhaps simply because he was older, and had more clearly contemplated what the inside of a prison cell implied for a man of his age and habits. He began to speak. At the moment Lestrade produced the caution, and once he began, he did not stop for a considerable time. Emerged was this. Conrad Calloway had approached Grantley some 14 months earlier, when it had become apparent that Dorothy Calloway was reconsidering her estate arrangements. She had consulted a different solicitor, not Beaumont, about the possibilities of a trust structure, and that solicitor had unwisely mentioned it to a colleague who knew Conrad. Conrad had been alarmed. He was in severe financial difficulty, and his aunt's inheritance, arriving in full as a capital sum, was the only realistic resolution of his situation. A trust would produce an income. An income would not satisfy a debt of £17,000, or the interest accumulating on it, particular lender who held that debt. Grantley himself. Grantley's plan, Conrad was at pains to establish with considerable specificity, possibly because he was calculating what a jury might make of relative culpabilities, had been developed over a period of 6 months. Grantley had identified the compound through his pharmacological knowledge and academic connections. He had used Pellard, his laboratory technician, to acquire and concentrate it. He had introduced it into the decanter on the 19th of October, during what he described to the household as a routine medical visit, by the simple expedient of slipping a prepared vial into the whiskey while Mrs. Calloway was occupied with a book, and Grantley was ostensibly reviewing her medication notes. Calculated dosing was intended to produce a cardiac event, sufficiently delayed that Grantley would have left the house by the time Mrs. Calloway collapsed. Conrad's role had been to remain in the house, ensure the body was found at the appropriate time, call Grantley back as attending physician. The forged will had been prepared in advance, and would be submitted to probate at the appropriate moment. "And the letter?" Holmes asked. "The letter that arrived at Baker Street, postmarked the 24th of October. Grantley looked at him. "We found a draft, in the study, among her papers. We did not know she had sent it. We did not know there was a completed version." He paused, found the draft, and believed we had found everything. "She was more careful than you," Holmes said, flatly, "by a considerable margin." What became apparent, what Holmes subsequently explained to me in the full detail that the compressed drama of the arrest had not allowed, was that the letter had in fact been posted by Miss Vance. Dorothea Calloway had written it on the 23rd of October, 2 days after her death, was certified, and had given it to Miss Vance sealed, with instructions not to open it, and to post it to a specific address only if certain conditions were met. Miss Vance, faithful even in her grief, had posted it on the 24th, as instructed, when it had become apparent to her that the will had been altered in a manner entirely inconsistent with everything Mrs. Calloway had ever said about her intentions. "She wrote it before she died," I said, when Holmes explained this to me later. "She wrote it anticipating she would die, gave it to Miss Vance as a dead letter instruction, and Vance posted it when the forged will came to light. She planned for her own murder," Holmes said quietly. "She could not prevent it. She was 70 years old, with a genuine heart condition. The compound's delayed action meant she had no way to know precisely when it would strike. But she could ensure that the truth survived her. Every element. The letter to Baker Street, the inscription in the painting, the sample in the pianoforte, was laid out in sequence, each element pointing to the next, designed to survive any ordinary search by people who would look for documents, not for systems. Quiet for a moment. She constructed a case against her own murderers from inside the circumstances of her murder. I have, in 17 years, never seen anything quite like it. Pellard was arrested at his Lambeth lodgings by Lestrade's men an hour after Conrad and Grantley were taken into custody. He offered no resistance. He had, it appeared, been expecting it since the night before, and had spent the intervening hours in a state of such extreme anxiety that the constables who arrived found him already dressed, his coat on, sitting by his window as if waiting for a train. Chapter 13. Every thread unravelled. The exhumation and subsequent toxicological examination of Dorothea Calloway's remains was carried out 11 days later, under the direction of a pathologist from University College Hospital, to whom Holmes provided a precise specification of what to seek. The results came back within a week. The compound identified in the veal from the pianoforte was present in tissue samples from the deceased, at a concentration consistent with the deliberate administration of a fatal dose, rather than any therapeutic accident. It was, Holmes had promised Lestrade, exactly what the body would show. The legal proceedings that followed were necessarily protracted. They extended through the winter and into the following spring. But the outcome was never seriously in doubt. From the moment the toxicology report was filed, Conrad Calloway and Dr. Seward Grantley were charged with murder. Pellard, who had cooperated with the prosecution in substantial detail from the moment of his arrest, charged as an accessory, and his testimony became the linchpin of the Crown's case, against Grantley in particular, establishing with precision the preparation and delivery of the compound. There was, as there always is in cases of this complexity, period during the investigation and the trial at which the defence attempted various challenges to the evidence. The forged will came under the most sustained attack. The defence argued that Crumb's identification of Grantley's handwriting in the commissioning letter was unreliable, and that the letter itself could have been fabricated. Holmes was called to give evidence on the subject of handwriting analysis, which he did with a thoroughness and a precision that left the defence counsel visibly regretting the challenge. He demonstrated, with examples on a large board that had been set up in the court, the specific characteristics of Grantley's handwriting as found in authenticated documents, patient notes, correspondence, published papers, and traced each characteristic through to the commissioning letter with the methodical calm of a man explaining something self-evident to a room full of people who are trying very hard to pretend it isn't. The jury were gone for 2.5 hours. Holmes and I heard the verdicts from Beaumont, who attended the court throughout. Men were found guilty of murder. The sentences were handed down, and that, as Holmes said when Beaumont's letter arrived at Baker Street, was that. But there remained things to be resolved beyond the courtroom, and it was with those that Holmes occupied himself in the days following the verdict, with a quiet attentiveness that I had rarely seen him extend to anything beyond an active case. The forged will was invalidated by the courts, and the original will, Beaumont's document, one prepared according to Dorothea Calloway's actual intentions, was restored. Miss Iris Vance received her annuity. Charitable Society received its bequest. The estate of Calloway House, after the settling of such debts as the courts determined legitimate, was to be administered by Beaumont in trust, the income directed according to Mrs. Calloway's original dispositions. Holmes took an unusual interest in ensuring that these resolutions proceeded correctly. He visited Beaumont twice to confirm the paperwork, which was not behaviour I would have predicted from a man who considered himself entirely above the administrative details of concluded cases. I mentioned this to him once, and he looked at me with a briefly unguarded expression and said, "She worked very hard to ensure that things came out right. It seems only appropriate that someone ensure they actually do." Miss Vance came to Baker Street one afternoon in late December to express her gratitude in person. She was composed, as she had been composed throughout, but she appeared better than she had on any of the occasions we had previously seen her. There was a quality of release in her bearing, as if a weight she had been carrying for a long time had been set down at last. She told me, at the end, that she hoped someone clever would see it. Miss Vance said, in the sitting-room at Baker Street, with the winter fog outside the window and the fire burning cleanly. I thought it was. I thought she was frightened and not herself. I didn't understand that she had already made a plan. A pause. She was cleverer than any of us knew. Most people in her position would have been simply afraid. She was afraid and methodical. The most useful combination, Holmes said. He was standing by the window with his pipe, in profile, and his voice was quieter than usual. Fear without method becomes paralysis. Method without urgency becomes complacency. Together, they can accomplish remarkable things. He turned slightly. She had more courage than most people I have encountered, Miss Vance. And she thought very clearly under extreme pressure, not common qualities. Miss Vance looked at him. "Will you include it in your accounts, Dr. Watson?" she asked, turning to me. "With your permission," I said. She considered this for a moment, her grey-green eyes steady. "Yes," she said. I think she would have wanted people to know that she was not simply a victim, that she saw what was happening, and she did something about it. Pause. She hesitated, even from where she was, even under those circumstances. The fire crackled, the clock counted seconds. Outside, London went about its particular business in the fog. Chapter 14 after the storm, Baker Street. It is a curious and persistent feature of concluding a case with Holmes that the ending is never quite where the story ends. The legal conclusion, the verdicts, the sentences, the administrative resolution of all the practical details arrives with satisfying finality, but Holmes himself is never fully concluded. He moves from the surface of one case into the depths of his own mind, turning the experience over, finding the aspects that will become part of his permanent understanding, and discarding the rest. I have observed this process dozens of times. It takes typically between 3 and 10 days. Then a new case arrives, or he makes one arrive through some Moken combination of restlessness and professional gravitational pull. and the cycle begins again, in the days following the resolution of what I had taken to calling in my private notes the Calloway affair. Holmes was unusually quiet, not the threatening silence of boredom, not the vacancy that preceded his more destructive periods of idleness. The violin at 3 a.m, the chemical experiments of dubious safety. But a thoughtful quiet, a ruminative stillness that I found, if anything, more characteristic of the man beneath the professional brilliance than most things he showed the world. He was thinking about Dorothea Calloway, fairly certain of this. And when I asked him, one evening over the fire, when we had finished dinner and the Baker Street world outside was conducting itself in its usual noisy nocturnal manner, he did not deny it. She built a case, he said, without preamble, as if the conversation had been going on already in his head, and I had merely caught up with it. Without training in detection, without the ability to share her evidence, Emmons, with anyone she trusted, with its full implications, without any confidence that she would survive to see it used. She built a case, methodically, comprehensively, with an understanding of how criminal minds operate that was, in its way, more intuitive than analytical. He set down his cup. I have been trying to identify the point at which she realized what was happening, when she shifted from unease to certainty. The decanter, I suggested. She said in her letter that she observed Grantley attending to it during his afternoon visit. Yes, but observing a physician touching a decanter does not in itself constitute evidence of murder. She had to have been watching for it. She had to have already been suspicious enough to be watchful. He tapped one finger on the arm of his chair. I think it was the will, someone told her, or she inferred from some small inconsistency, that a document had been prepared purporting to be her intentions, and that it was not, and she understood at that point the shape of what was being planned. He paused. Woman who knows she has been marked for murder has very limited options. She can flee. She can go to the authorities, but on the basis of what? Suspicious physician and a nephew who covets her money. Not enough. She can confront the principals, extraordinarily dangerous, or she can do what she did, ensure that when the inevitable occurs it does not go unpunished. She chose the hardest option, I said. She chose the only option that had a real chance of working, Holmes said. The others were either insufficient or suicidal. She was, Watson, a strategist. A genuine strategist. Someone who could see the board accept the constraints and work within them toward the best available outcome. He was quiet for a moment. There are things I could teach technically about the construction of evidence and the identification of criminal patterns. That quality, the capacity to think clearly in the presence of one's own fear, that cannot be taught. One either has it or one doesn't. Thought about what Miss Vance had said. Afraid and methodical. I thought about Dorothea Calloway in her East study on the evening of the 19th of October, having watched Grantley touch the decanter, knowing what it meant, extracting a sample with the calm precision of a scientist, writing a letter in the language of evidence, hiding it in a piano, going about her evening, drinking the whiskey that she already knew had been poisoned, because to refuse it would be to reveal that she knew. And if she revealed that she knew, the plan would change, and her preparations might be discovered. She had drunk it. Knowing. Holmes, I said. She drank the whiskey. Yes, he said, very quietly. She knew it was poisoned. She drank it anyway, to protect the case she had built. Yes. A pause. I have thought about that a great deal. Another pause. Longer. I do not have a neat philosophical observation to attach to it, Watson. It simply is what it is. She made a calculation that if she refused the whiskey, the plan would fail. Her evidence was worth more than her refusal. She was 70 years old, with a genuine heart condition. She knew. She wrote it in the letter. that she did not have many years left regardless, and she chose to spend the last hours she had making sure it meant something. The fire burned. Outside, a cab passed, its wheels loud on the cobbles, paused. Somewhere below, Mrs. Hudson was doing something in the kitchen that involved the rhythmic sounds of domestic certainty, small, reliable music of a well-run house. "There is a portrait of Alderman Calloway in that study," I said after a while, looking at the chair where she sat. "I know," Holmes said. "I wonder whether she found it comforting, having him there." "I wonder," Holmes agreed. He was looking at the fire, not at me, and his long face in the firelight was, for this one unguarded moment, entirely human, worn and thoughtful and full of something I could only call respect. "She was alone in that room, Watson, with her evidence and her calculation and her decision, and a dead man's portrait on the wall. She was very much alone. A beat, and she did not waver." He picked up his violin, not to play it, just to hold it, the way he sometimes did when his mind was in a place beyond the reach of his other habits. He sat with it in his lap, looking at the fire, said nothing more for a long while. I did not disturb him. There are moments, even in the company of the most restlessly social mind in London, when silence is the only adequate response to what has been understood. The case was closed. The guilty had been convicted. The innocent had been provided for. The machinery of justice, imperfect, slow, occasionally blind, had been directed, by one woman's extraordinary clarity of purpose, was to the precise point where it needed to function. And Sherlock Holmes made his life and his reputation from the orderly arrangement of facts, sat in his Baker Street chair on a December evening, and held a violin he was not playing, and gave to the memory of Dorothea Calloway the only form of tribute I had ever seen him offer to anyone. His complete and unperforming silence, which in him was worth more than any speech. 3 days later, a new client arrived, a shipping merchant from Bristol, with a tale of missing invoices and a brother he suspected, and Holmes was instantly and entirely himself again. Sharp, quick, dismissive of sentiment, grey eyes hard and bright and interested. He leaned forward in his chair and said, "Tell me everything, and be precise," and the game was on. But I noticed, for some days afterward, that the small painting on the bookshelf in the sitting room at Baker Street, a watercolour of the Sussex coast that Holmes had never particularly explained the presence of, had been moved 3 inches to the left. It now caught, in the early morning, clear shaft of winter light from the window. I never asked him about it. Some things do not require explanation. Some observations are sufficient in themselves.